Yamunatiramanacharya Kunja Bihari Krishna Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama Hare Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Jaya Prabhupada, Prabhupada, Jaya Prabhupada, Jaya Prabhupada. Jaya Om Vishnupad Paramahamsa Parvajikacharyato Tadasata Shri Śrīmad. Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada Ki, Ananta Koti Vaishnava Vrinda Ki, Gruntrad Śrīmad-Bhāgavatam Ki, Samveda Bhakta Vrinda Ki, Gaur Premanandi. All glories to the symbol of devotees. All glories to the symbol of devotees. All glories to the symbol of devotees. All glories to Sri Sri Guru and Sri Gauranga. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Ajnanatimirandasya Gananjana Shalakaya Chakshur Unmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobishtam Shtapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamhayam Dadati Swapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Yuta Padakamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavamscha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Ragunatanvitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadhunam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakanvitam Cha Hey Krishna Karuna Sindho Dina Bandho Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavan Eshvari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Vanchakalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindubhya Evacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda, Shri Advaita Gadadhara, Srivasadi Gaur Bhakta Vrinda, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. So we are beginning a new chapter. This is chapter 7 of Canto 3. We have 2 verses, but the first verse has no purport. So I'll read that one, the Sanskrit, and then we'll responsively do 3.7.2. Shri Shuka Uvacha Evam Bhuvana Maitreyang Dvaipayana Suto Buddha Pranayaniva Bharatya Vidura Pratyabhashata. Sri Shukadeva Goswami said, O king, while Maitreya, the great sage, was thus speaking, Vidura, the learned son of Dvaipayana, of Vyasadeva, expressed a request in a pleasing manner by asking this question. So again, I'll read that. Sri Shukadeva Goswami said, O king, while Maitreya, the great sage, was thus speaking, Vidura, the learned son of Dvaipayana, Vyasa, expressed a request in a pleasing manner by asking this question. So here's the question. And we'll read this one responsively. Vidura Uvacha, Brahman Katam Bhagavatas, Chinmatrasya Vikarinaha, Leela Ya Chapi Yujiran, Leela Ya Chapi Yujiran, Nirgunasya Gunakriyaha, Nirgunasya Gunakriyaha, Vidura Uvacha, Brahman Katam Bhagavatash, Chinmatrasya Vikarinaha, Leela Ya Chapi Yujiran, Nirgunasya Gunakriyaha, Vidura Uvacha, Brahman Katam Bhagavatas, Chinmatrasya Vikarinaha, Leela Ya Chapi Yujiran, Nirgunasya Gunakriyaha, Vidura Uvacha, Brahman Katam Bhagavatash, Chinmatrasya Vikarinaha, Leela Ya Chapi Yujiran, Nirgunasya Gunakriyaha, Vidura Uvacha, Brahman Katam Bhagavatash, Brahmasya Vikarinaha, Leela Ya Chapi Yujiran, Nirgunasya Gunakriyaha. Ladies. Vidura Uvacha, Brahman Katam Bhagavatash, Śrīmad-Bhāgavatam vikādinaha līlayā chāpiyujēran nirgunasya gunakriyaha. Vidura uvacha. Vidura said, Brahman, O Brahmana, Katam, how? Bhagavataha, of the personality of Godhead. Chit matrasya, of the complete spiritual whole. Avikarinaha, of the unchangeable. Līlayā, by his pastime. Cha, either. Api, even though it is so. Yujēran, take place. Nirgunasya, who is without the modes of nature. Gunaha, modes of nature. Kriyaha, activities. So the verse translation reads, Sri Vidura said, O great Brahmana, since the Supreme Personality of Godhead is a complete spiritual whole and is unchangeable, how is he connected with the material modes of nature and their activities? If this is his pastime, how do the activities of the unchangeable take place and exhibit qualities without the modes of nature? So I say, and you all please repeat. Sri Vidura said, O great Brahmana, since the Supreme Personality of Godhead is the complete spiritual whole and is unchangeable, how is he connected with the material modes of nature and their activities? If this is his pastime, how do the activities of the unchangeable take place and exhibit qualities without the modes of nature? Okay. So the purport by Prabhupada reads, as described in the previous chapter, a difference between the Supersoul, the Supreme Lord, and the living entities is that the activities of the Lord in creating the cosmic manifestation are performed by the Lord through the agency of his multifarious energies. But this manifestation is bewildering to the living entities. The Lord is therefore the master of the energies, whereas the living entities are subjugated by them. By asking various questions about transcendental activities, Vidura is clearing the misconception that when the Lord either descends on the earth in his incarnation or appears himself with all his potencies, he too is subject to the influence of Maya, just like an ordinary living entity. This is generally the calculation of less intelligent philosophers who consider the position of the Lord and that of a living entity to be on the same level. Vidura is hearing the great sage Maitreya refute these arguments. The Lord is described in this verse as Chinmatra, or completely spiritual. The personality of Godhead has unlimited potencies to create and manifest many wonderful things, both temporary and permanent. Because this material energy is the creation of his external energy, it thus appears to be temporary. It is manifest at certain intervals, maintained for some time, and again dissolved and conserved in his own energy, as described in Bhagavad Gita 8:19, Bhutva Bhutva Praliyate. But the creation of his internal potency, the spiritual world, is not a temporary manifestation like the material world, but is eternal and full of transcendental knowledge, opulence, energy, strength, beauty, and glories. Such manifestations of the Lord's potencies are eternal and are therefore called nirguna, or freed from the tinges of the modes of nature, even up to the modes of material goodness. The spiritual world is transcendental even to material goodness and thus is unchangeable. Since the Supreme Lord of such eternal and unchangeable qualities is never subjugated by anything like material influence, how can his activities and form be conceived to be under the influence of illusory maya, as is the case with the living entities? A juggler or magician displays many wonderful wonders with his acts and arts. He can become a cow by his magical tactics, and yet he is not that cow. But at the same time, the cow displayed by the magician is not different from him. Similarly, the material potency is not different from the Lord because it is an emanation from him. But at the time, that manifestation of potency is not the Lord. The Lord's transcendental knowledge and potency always remain the same. They do not change, even when displayed in the material world. As stated in Bhagavad Gita, the Lord descends on the earth by his own internal potency, and therefore there is no question of his becoming materially contaminated, changed, or otherwise affected by the modes of material nature. The Lord is saguna by his own internal potency, but at the same time he is nirguna since he is not in touch with the material energy. The restrictions of the prison house are applicable to the prisoners who are condemned by the king's law. But the king is never affected by such implications, although he may visit the prison house out of his goodwill. In the Vishnu Puran, the six opulences of the Lord are stated to be non-different from him. The opulences of the transcendental knowledge, strength, opulence, potency, beauty, and renunciation are all identical with the personality of Godhead. When he personally displays such opulences in the material world, they have no connection with the modes of material nature. The very word chin-ma-tratva is the guarantee that the Lord's activities are always transcendental, even when displayed in the material world. His activities are as good as the Supreme Personality himself. Otherwise, liberated devotees like Shukadeva Goswami would not have been attracted by them. Vidura inquired how the Lord's activities can be in the modes of material nature, as is sometimes miscalculated by persons with a poor fund of knowledge. The inebriety of the material qualities is due to the difference between the material body and the spirit soul. The conditioned soul's activities are displayed through the medium of the modes of material nature and are therefore perverted in appearance. However, the Lord's body and the Lord himself are one and the same. And when the Lord's activities are displayed, they are certainly non-different from the Lord in all respects. The conclusion is that persons who consider the Lord's activities material are certainly mistaken. Okay, it's a fairly good-sized purport. Vidura uvacha brahman katam bhagavatash chinmatrasya vikarinaha lilaya chapi yujyeran nirgunasya guna kriyaha. Sri Vidura said, O great Brahmana, since the Supreme Personality of Godhead is the complete spiritual whole and is unchangeable, how is he connected with the material modes of nature and their activities? If this is his pastime, how do the activities of the unchangeable take place and exhibit qualities without the modes of material nature? So this is beginning a new chapter here. In the previous chapter, We heard Maitreya describe how the various demigods were answered by the Supreme Lord, and then how they entered into the universal form. And then we heard about the glories of that universal form. That was what was taking place yesterday even. Today we're starting a new chapter, and in this chapter, chapter 7 of 3rd Canto, Vidura will ask Maitreya questions, and Maitreya will answer them. And one of the first questions is about how the Supreme Lord deploys his energies and how he can be considered to be actually unchangeable. Then later on he will ask how the material world actually comes from him and what is the nature of the material world. So he'll ask several questions in this chapter, and then Maitreya will answer them. The big issue here that we're starting off with is this concept of the nature of the Supreme when he enters into the material world. We are living entities. We come here not because we necessarily wanted to come here. We did in one sense. We wanted to enjoy like the Supreme. Therefore, that's not possible in the spiritual world. So we have to go to some alternative. And that alternative is, you're looking at it right here, the material world. The Supreme Lord creates this alternative material world just so the living entity can play out his fantasy of being independent of the Supreme Lord and trying to appease his various material desires here. So everyone in the material world is under that condition. They are trying to appease their material desires. And the Supreme Lord has created a place where the living entities can do that. And they can turn their back on the Supreme Lord. So the living entity comes here to the material world and turns his back on the Supreme Lord. Once he does that, the Supreme Lord captures his attention with the false ego, and the false ego causes the living entity to imagine that he is the body that he's residing in, and that the material world is actually desirable, and there are many things here which the living entity can explore. So the living entity tries to explore the material world and tries to pander to his various material desires, but it never exactly works out. The living entity discovers his material desires are not satisfying, and the living entity discovers that there are many interesting types of suffering and pain and fear and unwanted things that exist in the material world, which he did not bargain for when he left the material world. So he's here. It's not such a happy, copacetic place where all the happy campers are enjoying themselves in various ways. Instead, it's kind of, in short, a horror story, what's going on here in the material world. But the living entity is clinging fast to his material desires, so he ignores the horror story and focuses on those few raisins of happiness that do occur every once in a while. And in this way, he convinces himself that this is life. So the Supreme Lord is never placed into the material world under those circumstances. The Supreme Lord comes here of his own volition, and he is not placed by the material energy into the material world. Indeed, the material world is one of his energies, you know. Parasya Shaktir Vividaya Shruyate, you know. So the living entity is one of the Supreme Lord's energies. He's called the marginal energy, or the Tatastha Shakti. And the material world is also one of his energies. It's called the Bahiranga Shakti. So the external energy is the material world, the living entities are marginal energies. We are here, and the Supreme Lord is neither of those. He's the sum total of it all. And he is the internal energy. He comes under his own volition, and he is not subjected to the parameters of the three modes of nature. Everything in the material world is indeed operated by the three modes of nature. We just heard about that when the material world unfolds, first false ego is created, then from false ego comes the three modes of nature. And then false ego and the three modes of nature again interact with one another and create further developments. So when a person enters the three modes of nature, is put into a material body, identifies with that body, and that body is pushed around by the three modes of nature. This is certainly not happening to the Supreme Lord. He is always free from the three modes of nature. He is always their master. He is never their servant. Even when the Supreme Lord, as an actor on the stage, appears, and sometimes he does, he appears to be bewildered, or he asks some one of his friends or consorts for some advice. He may appear to not be able to do something, but all this is just a show. He is at all times the possessor, as we hear, of six opulence: wealth, strength, knowledge, beauty, fame, and renunciation. He is never out of touch with the full extent of all six opulences. So these are, explained by Parashara Muni, and then Prabhupada gives a different, citation here. But basically, the six opulences are there in full in the Supreme Lord. Every living entity in the material world can only have a small portion of them. Generally, it's said that we have only 78% of the powers of the Supreme, and that in minute proportion. It's not that we have 78% of his potency. We have 78% of the categories of his potency. So there are 64 opulences that the Supreme Lord possesses, and we don't possess them all. We possess only 78% of them, and that in minute proportion. The demigods possess the same quantity, but in a greater proportion. And there are a few demigods that possess them in a larger percentage. And of course, the direct expansions of the Supreme Lord possess 60 of the 64. So they possess those 60 of the 64 in full measure, but they don't possess 4 that only Krishna himself possesses. So whenever we talk about the Supreme Lord, it's always a kind of curious dance of language because our language is designed to communicate our experiences as human beings to one another. And when we're talking about the Supreme Lord, certainly there is an analogous idea there when we say something about the Supreme Lord, because we experience something similar as human beings. When we use those same words and those same constructions in human language, whether it's Sanskrit or English or whatever language, when we use those words, they capture something about the Supreme Lord, but they also miss. Because we know what we mean when we say, I'm hungry or you're hungry. We know what we mean when we say that I am going to die or you're going to die. But when we say any of these things about the Supreme Lord, the meaning becomes shaded and nuanced, because whatever you say about the Supreme Lord, essentially you can say the opposite thing, and it's also true. And that's what's sometimes confusing or even bewildering to people, because we hear so many places in Scripture where we say one thing about the Supreme Lord, and the next sentence we say the opposite thing about him. Here, Prabhupada says, Supreme Lord is Saguna, and then we hear him saying he's Nirguna. In Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says, I enter into the material world, yet I do not enter into it. We find out that the Supreme Lord is smaller than the smallest, but greater than the greatest. He's very near, yet he's very far away. And yet he's all these things, all these things simultaneously, And so this is what's sometimes confusing about the Supreme Lord. We're not speaking gibberish, and we're not talking double talk. Usually when we say he's something, but he's also not that very same thing, there's a nuance in the way that he is that thing, and a difference in the way he's not that thing. Om Purnam Ada Purnam Idam Purnat Purnam Udachyate. Purnasya Purnam Adaya Purnam Eva Vishishyate. So the Ishopanishad verse is describing that everything comes from him. He's perfect and complete, and all perfect and complete wholes emanate from him. Yet although many perfect and complete wholes emanate from the Supreme Lord, he remains a complete balance. He's never diminished. He doesn't lose something because a emanation comes from him, and that emanation, since it is connected with him, it's also perfect and complete. Even the material world is perfect and complete. It can be said, as Krishna does in the Bhagavad Gita, this is his divine energy. However, it has a very curious way of working, and that way is designed by the Supreme Lord to appear to block our connection, our perception of the Supreme. So Prabhupada points out the fact that the Supreme is called Chinmatrasya here, or Chinmatra, which means he's perfect, and he is complete, and he is never diminished under any circumstance. When he comes to the material world, he's not subjected. And we hear that analogy of a king coming to the material world. The king is never under the subject of, the king comes to a prison. The king is never subject to the laws of the prison, yet he actually makes the laws of the prison, and he can leave whenever he likes, whereas the prisoners cannot do so. So that's the difference here. And this is an important topic that gets brought up in other places by Prabhupada, because Sankaracharya tried to put forward the idea that the Supreme Lord being changeable is not acceptable. Therefore, the Supreme Lord can have no form. So this is later discussed in the Chaitanya Charitamrita in Adi Leela 7. We hear about what's known as Parinamavad and Vivartavad. So the Sanskrit Vivarta means to be mistaken about something or be in illusion about something, whereas Parinama means that a thing is transformed. It is not Krishna that's changing when the material world is being emanated. Krishna is merely transforming his energies. It's his energies that are transforming. Krishna himself remains the same. He is the same today, yesterday, in a million years. He always is, always was the same. But the material world comes and goes. So his various energies, parinam, they are transforming into the material world. And they do so temporarily, and then the material world is again annihilated, bhutva praliyate, as we find out in the Bhagavad Gita. So the various universes, when we find out Brahma's day starts, the universes are expanded, and again when Brahma's night comes, bhutva praliyate, they are again dissolved or destroyed. So this is the process of creation and annihilation. And through this creation and annihilation, the living entities remember and forget, remember and forget. They play out a lifetime, they forget that lifetime. They play out another lifetime, they forget that lifetime. They rack up karma, bad points, karma, good points. Then they come back in another lifetime and enjoy the karma good points, suffer the karma bad points. And this goes on until finally a person comes in contact with the Supreme Lord's devotees and learns that this is a stupid way to waste your life. And we begin the process of devotional service. And through learning the rules of devotional service, and there are rules to it, we can gradually be lifted up out of the modes of nature too, because just like the Supreme, we also have no connection with the modes of nature. That is, when we're in our constitutional position, when we are free from false ego, then we also have no connection with the modes of nature. And therefore, we become candidates for going back to the spiritual world where we come from. So let me pause at this point and ask for questions, realizations, whatever. Yes, we have Kyle's got a question here.
Hare Krishna, thank you for giving class. So just a thought kind of came to me actually when you were talking about, how we are in the spiritual world and then we decide like, oh, we want to enjoy separately from Krishna, so we come here. And the thought that came to me was, so here we have books about the spiritual world. In the spiritual world, do they have books about the material world? Like, can't we just like teach ourselves not to come here? Like, why can't we just like practice like Krishna consciousness there too? And like, oh, the material world, yeah, we don't want to come back here. Like, who's preaching that in the spiritual world?
Well, the situation is like this. There's something called free will. If there wasn't, we'd all be robots, As once Radhanath Swami gave the example, if you program a computer to put out lines of I love you, I love you, I love you, I love you, it can do that. Even it can do it at thousands of times a second. Somehow we don't believe the computer that it really does love us, because the fact is that it just does whatever we tell it, So similarly, there has to be a thing called free will. Otherwise, we'd all be robots, and love would be meaningless. So that exists not just in the material world. Free will exists in the spiritual world as well. So when the living entity discovers or decides, and there's always a possibility this could happen, that why is the Supreme Lord in the center of everything? Not like he thinks, let me come to the material world necessarily. He thinks, why does it always have to be Krishna that's at the center? Why can't sometimes I be at the center? Just let me be Mr. Big with everybody dancing around me. So then we immediately get the ticket to the material world, and then we learn all about it. In general, some acharyas commented that people in the spiritual world are not aware of the material world. Other places I've heard that they are, to some extent, In any case, the issue is that for one reason or another, and this is causeless, because there's nothing in the spiritual world that's going to force us to think about wanting to come to the material world, nor is there any bad example there that we can follow, nor is there any reason the Supreme Lord would tempt us in some particular way. Yet, free will eternally exists. It must, and it must exist in the spiritual world. So, Krishna Bahirmukha Hanya Bhogavanchakare Nikatastamaya Japatiyadare. So, in the Prema Vivarta, it says that when the living entity turns his face away from Krishna, immediately this material nature slaps him down into the material world. Krishna Bahirmukha Hanya Bhogavanchakare Nikatastamaya Japatiyadare. So we leave the material world, not knowing what we're getting ourselves up into, not knowing what we signed up for.
Right.
But we come here, and the next thing we're doing something in Brooklyn or wherever we wind up peregrinating to here in the material world. So maybe that helped.
I hope someone in the spiritual world writes a book soon to save us from this material condemnation. Thank you. Thank you.
Other questions? So it's interesting, actually, that the material energy is also one of Krishna's energies. We spoke about the other day that both Shiva and his wife are masters and of the material energy. So Parvati is actually what's known as Mahamaya. She is an expansion for creating illusion. But there is also Yogamaya. Both exist. Now, Yogamaya is not Shiva's wife. Yogamaya is actually Subhadra, Krishna's sister. So it's different. Yet, they do expand from Radharani somewhere up the line. This is the nature of Krishna and his many telescopes. Krishna's energies are telescoping out in such various different ways. And this Parasya Shakti or Vividaya Shruyate, that Krishna expands, and then you have Srimati Radharani expanding, and you get at one point Yogamaya, at another point you get Mahamaya. And they act in a similar way, but they are very different. Yogamaya is the potency that keeps the devotee from actually recognizing that the Supreme Lord is the Supreme. The devotees who are intimate with the Supreme, they love Krishna, but they're unable to fully grasp that he's the Supreme. Because if they did, that would color the relationship. You can have an intimate relationship with someone, or you can have a relationship of awe and respect. But you can't really have both of those relationships at the same time. And that's why, Dasyaras and, Sakya or Madhurya or Vatsalya-ras are incompatible with Dasyaras. If you see the Supreme Lord as being the center of the entire universe, that one from which everything emanates, and you're aware of that at a very deep level, it weakens your ability to feel intimate with the Supreme Lord. You can't experience that. So Yogamaya allows that to be happening. That's why when Yashoda Mai looks into Krishna's mouth and she sees the universe in there, she thinks, wait a minute. Oh, it must be I must have eaten something wrong, or I must be imagining something, or maybe the demigods are playing some trick on me, So she thinks like that. Or Nanda Baba, when, the cowherd men are saying some amazing thing that Krishna did. He thinks, maybe they're exaggerating a little bit. Maybe it really didn't happen that way, But I know my child does some pretty interesting things, Possibly he's been blessed by the demigods and they're doing things for him. That's the way he thinks, He never thinks that, well, sometimes it sort of comes into his mind and then it just disappears again. Those who are very intimately related with the Supreme Lord, they can't really remain in that type of consciousness for very long. However, we look on the other hand, Mahamaya does a different thing. She has her what is it? Pratipatmaka and Avaranaksham. What is it? Yeah. Somehow I can't get the word out of my mouth. So she throws and covers. We're also unaware of who Krishna is, but not in the same mood as those who are intimate with Krishna. We are unaware of Krishna, and we're happy that we're unaware of him, and we want to be aware of ourselves, because if we were aware of the potencies and the magnitude of Krishna and all that he can do and all that he is, it would rain on our parade that we are the supreme. And so Krishna keeps himself kind of hidden and allows us, to imagine, that we are something very amazing and wonderful. And we carry that, through every day. And this is part of what we are fighting against as devotees is, desire for profit, adoration, and distinction that the living entities hunger for. So, we want to be noticed, we want to be singled out, we want to be glorified in some way, puja, labha, puja, and pratishta. And this is normal. Everyone in the material world kinds of sees this as normal. But as devotees, we begin to see that this has kind of an odor to it. And we should not really think in this way very much. Although we'll find ourselves thinking like this, it happens all the time, We're chanting, but at the same time, we're thinking about ourselves, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare. Chandrasekhar is very wonderful. He's very Hare Krishna, Krishna. And then, well, I'll prove to everybody because I do, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna. So we are striving somehow or another to focus on Krishna's name, not on our exploits and our plan for how we will prove to the world that we are maybe not Krishna, but pretty dang close, or something in that same category. And this is kind of the way that the material world works on us. So we are attempting to get free from these things because they are called, unwanted creepers, So these unwanted creepers that Lord Chaitanya explains are what wrap around the Bhakti Lata Bija. The Bhakti Lata Bija is the seed of devotional service, which is given by the spiritual master. And then the seed begins to grow as a plant. But there are various unwanted things that, or unwanted creepers that can encircle the Bhakti Lata Bija, choke it and stop it from growing. So, Nisidachara kuti nati jiva himsana labha puja pratishtadi yata upasaka gan. So, Nisidachara kuti nati, we have the various unwanted creepers or unwanted things that are a part, tend to blossom out at the time when our devotional service starts. And then we have to actually recognize them and root them out like a gardener would. When you're growing a plant in a garden, you will notice that weeds sprout up alongside the plant and you have to remove them. So Nishidachara. So Nishidachara is unwanted activities not befitting a devotee. Kuti nati is fault finding. Jiva himsa is violence against others. Nisidachara kuti nati jiva himsana. Labha is profit. Labha puja is worship. Pratishtadi, distinction. Yata upasaka gan. So these, upasaka is creepers. Upasaka is also unwanted, and gana means many of them. So these are the things that we have to be on the lookout for. because it's not like maybe they'll come in your effort to become Krishna conscious. They certainly will. And you have to recognize them when they come and uproot them and get rid of them, because otherwise your bhakti lata bij may become stunted or choked by them. That's what Lord Chaitanya is describing, in Chaitanya Charitamrita. Nisidachara kuti nati jiva himsana laba puja pratishtadi yata upasakagan. So we have to be careful to avoid these. Any final questions before? Yes. What's that? Yeah, okay.
So,
we'll give you 2, and we won't charge you extra.
oh, thank you. So the first question is a bit on a lighter note. So that is regarding Subhadra Mai. After Kamsa in the prison tried to kill her, then she went up in the sky and sort of she disappeared. And then next time she appeared was in Balaram's palace in Dwarka. So I always wondered, how did that happen,
Yeah, good question. I've thought about that myself, and I've never run across anywhere where we have a very expanded explanation of exactly how Subhadra, lives her life, how she comes, and exactly how she appears, and later on Arjuna falls in love with her, and all the other kinds of things going on. Yeah, so I'm afraid I can't help much there, at least.
Okay. And actually there's another question on that, but that's not so important. I asked the important question. That is, at the end you spoke about the Bhakti Lata, and also you spoke in the first part of the class how there's very important, there's a process, so there's rules, there's regulations, it's very scientific. So now I was thinking about 2 persons we're preaching to in Melbourne, and they've been around for a little bit of time, like 1 or 2 years already, but they can't fully practice because one of them has a girlfriend, he has been in a relationship for like 7 years or something, so it's a bit difficult, and the other person, he has a kid, he's a daughter, and he's been married also for a long time. But both of them, they're chanting, they're reading, they're trying to practice as much as they can. But my question is, how deep can they go? How much advancement they can make?
Mm-hmm. Well, anyone can make advancement. However, we do find oftentimes, that according to the association that you have, your advancement can either be accelerated or it can be decelerated. And that's why Lord Chaitanya mentions, and also in the Nectar of Devotion, it mentions that one of the important aspects of devotional service is association with devotees. So if one has association with devotees, there's a good chance that one's spiritual life will gradually be bumped up a notch. Whereas similarly, if we associate with those who are complete wet blankets of spiritual life, then our devotional life will be retarded by that. And that's why one needs to give up such association, Of course, it may take some time to do that, Even Prabhupada gave up association with his own family at a certain point when he realized that they were really not very much interested, in, the famous tea or me, ultimatum. And his wife chose the tea, So at any rate, these things are kind of humorous in some ways. In other ways, they seem to be very, they do provide very serious impediments to devotional progress. So that's why we should try to focus on devotional service as much as we can and get association of those who are like-minded, who want to go forward in devotional life. In the Harinam Chintamani, we're told that we should avoid the Dharma Dwaji, the the aparadi, and we're supposed to avoid the one who is what is it? I'm trying to remember. There are those who are pretenders, aparadi. Oh, and the mayavadi. We're supposed to avoid those. Those categories of people can stunt our devotional life or retard it. People who are offensive, people who are mayavadis, people who are dharmadwaji. Dharmadwaji is someone who is apparently a devotee on the outside, but they have some material motivation why they're doing what they're doing. These people are also to be avoided. Of course, one needs to avoid those who are serious about sex life in many different forms. Those four categories are described in the Harinam Santamani as what we need to avoid to make progress in Krishna consciousness. All right, so we're about 1 or 2 minutes over. I thank you very much for your kind attention. All glories to Śrīmad-Bhāgavatam. All glories to the Vaishnava devotees of the Lord. Hare Krishna. Shri Radha Govinda Day.